Every millisecond of your pain from the fallen nature or fallen man, every millisecond of your misery in the path of obedience is producing a peculiar glory you will get because of that. It's working for you an eternal weight of glory. Therefore, do not lose heart.
Though you slay me, yet I will praise you.
What's up, everyone, and welcome to the New Life Experience. If you've been with us for honestly the last 4.5 months, you know we've been walking through this series called You Asked, and then it's essentially a hot topic or a question that someone's had, and we've talked through it, we've debriefed it. Maybe it was just a sermon that I got to speak on a Wednesday night, or maybe it was answering questions like, does baptism save you? And if you believe that, what does that mean for you? There's just so many different things that we had the opportunity to talk about in that series. It was really cool, and I really enjoyed it, but I definitely felt the Lord calling the ministry and the channel to move on from that series after 4 months of just really digging into questions, digging into ideas, into passages, and move on to a series that would actually be super beneficial and super helpful to the people really of this world and of this culture. And so what we are kicking off today is our series in Ecclesiastes. I haven't done a ton of series just walking through books of the Bible, but this will definitely be one of them. If you need some good resources on how to study the book of Ecclesiastes, I will go ahead and tell you on the front. The ones that I'm listening to are the Amen podcast. It's a couple or a family out in Hawaii, and they have a house church, and they do a series on Ecclesiastes, and it's incredible, and it challenges your thinking and how you approach life and all of these different things, just like the book of Ecclesiastes does. And so I would highly recommend listening to their resources. Another resource that I used a little bit less, I believe only had one episode on it, but it's the Bama Discipleship podcast. That is definitely something I pull a lot of information, a lot of material from. So those are the two main sources that I'm using, as well as just diving into the text, thinking about what I know about life and practical ministry and all of these things. So welcome to the series on Ecclesiastes. So if you have your Bibles, and I hope you do, open with me to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. And we're going to start in verse 1. Now, some background. Ecclesiastes was actually one of the highest debated books for the Old Testament canon. Now, if you don't know what the canon means, it's essentially just a fancy word that describes hey, here's the books in the Bible. And so when the New Testament was being written, the letters from Paul, the Gospels, there were councils that sat down and they said, okay, here's the books that we're going to put in the New Testament, and here's the ones that we're not. But for the Old Testament, these have been around a lot longer. But back in the day, when they were deciding what's going to be in the Old Testament canon, Ecclesiastes was actually one that was really highly debated because of the line of thinking which Ecclesiastes approaches. See, here's the thing. A lot of books in the Old Testament and the New Testament, just the Bible in general, they approach things from this God-centric, hey, here's the way God views this, here's the way God sees this, here's what God's going to do about it. But the book of Ecclesiastes actually takes us into a very different perspective. You'll notice the phrase under the sun a lot. The book of Ecclesiastes is actually writing as if really earth is all that we know. This is before we really have much concept of us traveling around the sun and things like this. All of this is just written from the earth perspective, under the sun. Here's what this looks like. Here's how I can understand it. And it's a philosophy book that continues to build on itself. Typically, the temptation is we open the book of the Bible and we read a chapter or a few verses or 2 chapters or 5 chapters or whatever it might be. And we're okay, this is exactly what this text means. Note it, and we move on, and we don't recircle back to those ideas. But see, here's the thing. Ecclesiastes isn't written like that. The author, it's commonly attributed to Solomon. We'll dive into that in just a moment. But the author writes it in such a way where he brings up an idea. He kind of fades away, starts chasing something else, and then he comes back to that idea and he goes, actually, here's what I think about this. And so it's this constant, never-ending kind of thought process. It's a philosophy book that is incredibly complicated because it was written, it was ascribed to the wisest man of all time, Solomon, other than Jesus, obviously. So let's start off diving in. It says in verse 1, it says, the words of the teacher, son of David, king of Jerusalem. Now, if you look back at Proverbs and even Song of Solomon, it says this is written by Solomon, son of David, king of Jerusalem. But see, here's the thing, it doesn't say that. It says these are the words of the teacher. It doesn't actually give us the name Solomon. Now, why might this be? Now, Solomon could just be trying to give a little bit of a different approach to this book. He might have not felt it was necessary. He might have just wanted to change up the vibe a little bit. It's not necessarily saying it wasn't written by Solomon, but we can start thinking, okay, maybe it was someone else. Maybe it was a scribe for Solomon, someone who would listen to the words of Solomon and then write them down. And thus, technically, it wasn't technically Solomon who penned the book, but it is the words of Solomon, the teacher, the son of David, the king of Jerusalem. So we can approach this idea and we can think maybe it was a scribe, maybe it was a female scribe that he had, and this is why the name isn't mentioned. But either way, we can assume that these words, these ideas, are coming from Solomon, and maybe were or were not penned by him. But either way, we can trust or believe or think or meditate on the idea that they were coming from Solomon. Also, because of the great wisdom that we see in this book, we know that it obviously was coming from someone who was pretty wise. So here's the thing to note, though. It says the words of the teacher. Now, if you look at this word in Hebrew, which is what the book of Ecclesiastes is written in, it's a word kohelet. Now, that word literally means leader of the assembly, or really leader of the called out ones. We get the name Ecclesiastes from essentially like the translation game, where it's like, okay, we translated it from Hebrew to Greek to Latin to English, thus we end up with Ecclesiastes. The word Ecclesiastes sounds very similar to the word ecclesia, which means called out ones, where we get the word church. So essentially, we can assume like this is a letter, the mindset is written to the believers. And so this is a way that we can think about this. But again, that word, their teacher, is kohelet. Kohelet means the leader of the assembly. The idea is that Solomon is writing this to like the flock, to the people of Israel. And so he's writing this text to the people who are following after God, who are saying, he's saying, hey, here's this perspective, here's this philosophy, here's this thought process. How can we apply it and how can we make the most of it? So the words of the teacher, literally this idea, Kohelet, the leader of the assembly, the leader of the called out ones, which is very obviously, you can see the connection to Kohelet, which is in Hebrew, and Ecclesiastes, which is obviously in English, which just means like letter to or writings to called out ones. It's the idea we get in the church versus literally the assembly, which is just the people of God. And so this is the idea that we get right off the bat. The words of the teacher, Kohelet, the leader of the assembly, the leader of the flock, the leader of the tribe, son of David, king of Jerusalem. So this is obviously where we get the idea like, oh, this is Solomon. Like Solomon is the son of David and also the king of Jerusalem. This is where that idea stems from. But then he goes on and he says in verse 2, absolute futility. Says the teacher, says the Kohelet, the leader of the assembly, absolute futility. Everything is futile. This is the idea that Solomon is presenting. He's saying, hey, you know what? Everything, and you might see this, actually, I have a sticker on my computer that says everything is meaningless. The idea is that, hey, nothing matters. This is the idea that he's presenting. And again, this is something he's going to present an idea and then he's going to circle back to it. But the question is, when you look at the Hebrew of this verse 2, what is he really trying to point out? And why does he keep using the word futility? See, here's the thing. When you're reading the Bible and you notice something that's repeated or it's said twice or it's said again later on, typically the author is trying to clue you into something. See, in the Hebrew text, they didn't have quotation marks, parentheses, bold, underline, highlight. They had none of that. They had to use the text and build the text in such a way where it would point to something, the idea that they were trying to get across. And so when you look at the Hebrew of this verse, it's absolute futility, says the teacher. Absolute futility, everything is futile. And when you look at that in Hebrew, that word is actually in there 7 times. Now, if you know anything about gematria, which is the idea that numbers mean something a lot greater than just a value, you know that the number 7 is the number of completion. Not perfection, but completion. The world was finished in 7 days, which God rested. And we see this idea of 7 repeated time and time again. The word futile being in there 7 times is Solomon writing in, or the idea writing in, or writing in the idea that everything, the totality, is futile. Everything is meaningless. Is this idea that he's trying to prescribe. And so in verse 3, he continues, what does a person gain for all of his efforts? And this is where we get the phrase that he labors under the sun. It's this idea of, hey, what does a person gain? Everything is meaningless. And then under the sun, what? So we get this earth perspective, and he elaborates on this. He says, a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets, panting, but it returns to its place where it rises, gusting to the south, turning to the north, turning goes the wind, and the wind returns in its cycles, and the streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things, literally all words, are wearisome, more than anyone can say. The eye has not satisfied by seeing, or the ear filled with its hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Can one say about anything, look, this is new? It has already existed in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of those who came before and those who will come after. There will also be no remembrance by those who follow him. So this idea that Solomon is presenting is he's like, hey, there's like everything's meaningless. The streams flow into the ocean, but the ocean is never full. Like you can see, but your eyes never satisfy. That's why we're always creating new art and new iPhones and new paintings and new landscapes and all of this stuff. The eye is never satisfied. The ear hears all the time, but the ear's never satisfied. That's why we're always creating new music and new rhythms and new beats and new chords and all of these different things. He says the wind blows to the east and to the west and to the south and to the north, but it just keeps blowing. The sun rises and it sets and it rises and it sets, but it just keeps doing it. And this idea that we see is almost this like rhythmic pattern of just incompleteness. This world is broken. It's not where it needs to be. And this is the idea of vapor. This idea of futility. The word in Hebrew is abel or habel, which is the idea of like think about when you go outside and it's really cold to the point where you can see your breath. When you exhale, you can see your breath particles in the air and then they disappear. This is the idea that he's trying to get across. Habel. It is that quick and that like, okay, that air is gone. It didn't matter. This is the idea that Solomon is trying to show us. It's absolutely futile. You breathe out, you can see your air for a moment, and then it's gone. It's the idea that James talks about when he says life is but a vapor. Everything is futile. Habel. And it's also actually synonymous. It's the same word as the name Abel back in Genesis, where he got 6 verses. He gave his best, his brother gave his worst, and then Abel was killed because of it. Habel is futile. So this idea that Solomon is painting is actually, I feel like almost kind of a sad picture. The idea is like it's talking about evil and suffering. It's talking about humanity and death. This is the teacher was convinced that life was often futile and empty of meaning. Generations come and go only to be forgotten, having made no progress. The Book of Ecclesiastes frequently criticizes the traditional views that good will succeed and the wicked will suffer. According to the writer's experience and observations, that formula will not always work. Sometimes the bad will succeed and the good will suffer. His teaching warns us not to make an ironclad rule out of proverbial wisdom. Some suffering is the testing of our faith. Other suffering might fit into God's redemption purposes. But see, here's the idea. It's not necessarily predictable. The world's different. This world that we live in, this is all philosophy books, so it's deep and it's tough to get your mind around. But see, here's the thing: the earth is not what we expect it to be. This world is harsh. It's difficult. It's tough. Wind blows, streams flow, like these different things. Generations come and they go. But at the end of the day, what impact can we make? Like in 1,000 years, is anyone going to look back and go, Sam Huber had a really cool YouTube channel, and they did a series on Ecclesiastes? It's probably not going to happen. There's some names like that, but even early church fathers, the dudes who were pillars to the start of the faith, their names are already forgotten. Like you don't remember most of those names. Now, some people do. Some people study church history and know it really well, or you might know some of them, but by and large, you're not going to know many of the early church father names. Most people don't know any of like the historians, people like John Calvin, people even now like John Piper, even guys like David Platt or Matt Chandler or Robbie Gallaty. Like these names you hear, they probably won't be remembered in 1,000 years from now. Because here's the thing, our names, what we bring to the table doesn't last. What we bring is futile. What we bring is that breath and the cold air where it's there for a second and then it's gone immediately. So what's the takeaway from this honestly kind of humbling, sad, disappointing kind of look at existence? What's the takeaway? The idea is it's not about what you can bring to the table. It doesn't matter. What Sam Huber brings to the table is not important, not relevant. It's not going to bring growth and development and life into this world. It's only going to be what comes from the Spirit. Why? Because I'm flesh. What Sam Huber and his flesh can bring is just a bunch of empty words. But when they're fueled by the Spirit, when the Spirit indwells it, it is no longer futile. It's no longer that Habel, because we have the Ruach, which is the Spirit, it's the breath of God. These are the conflicting ideas. You essentially get Habel, which is like empty breath, and Ruach, which is like meaningful breath. With Habel, we've got nothing. It's just flesh. It's futile. It's Abel. He brought his best gift, and what was it? Still led him to death. But then when we have the Ruach, the Spirit of God, we can bring our offerings, we can bring our sacrifices, our time, and everything changes, because where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's change, there's growth, there's development, there's impact. And so essentially the takeaway, the idea, the application is like, what are you doing in your flesh that you need to go, you know what, this isn't actually making any impact because it's just what I can do in my flesh. Versus what are you doing in the Ruach, in the Spirit, where it's actually going to outlive you, where you're living a legacy, where you're doing stuff that's going to outlive yourself, so that people can see life change. If you're a follower of Christ, the whole idea, your existence is so focused on kingdom impact. You want to see lives changed and people come to know Christ. That's your desire. That's your goal. That's your desperation, your heartbeat. Your heart pulses to see people come to know the King. That's what you want. And so let me ask you, are you acting out of the Habel, the futile? Or are you acting out of the Ruach, which is the meaningful, the impactful, the important? How are you walking? How are you living? What are you striving for? What are you desperate for? I just finished reading Isaiah chapter 1 this morning. And it's essentially this idea of the people of God forgetting everything. Like the God has given these people so much. He's brought them into the promised land, and they're here, and they've forgotten everything that the Lord has done, and they just like fold like a lawn chair. And they give into sin, and God's like, what are you doing? Why are you walking in sin? Why are you walking in brokenness? Turn back to me. And I can purify you. I can wash the blood off your hands. You can't do that because you're full of Habel. You're like your human breath is not worth anything. But it's the breath of the Spirit that actually can change. That's what can wash your hands clean. It is the righteousness of God, the righteousness of Christ, that we can be made pure, that we can be made whole, that we can be changed and transformed by His power. And so let me encourage you, brother, sister, as we begin this Ecclesiastes series, are you walking in the Habel breath that will only last for a vapor? Or are you walking in the Ruach Spirit, which will outlive you, where not everything is futile because it is done and fueled and impacted by the power of God? Which are you walking in? And what can you do to walk more in the Spirit than you presently are? Love you guys. I'll see you next week.
You slay me, yeah.